Hello and welcome back to the channel, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're taking a look at the Zero Gravity Summit mount. This comes courtesy of my friend and supporter Eric over at tnaguns.com, or TNA for short. Yes, that is a pun 100% intended. TNA is a small FFL, and he stocks things like the Summit mount as well as many other accessories and firearms. So if you are interested in this, or perhaps some other accessories for your setup, please give him an email, let him know that I sent you, and he should be able to hook you up. As the name might suggest, Summit by Zero Gravity means that this thing is probably going to be very light. So let's take a much closer look at this thing and see what your roughly $360 buys you. As both the name of the company and the name of the mount suggests, this thing should be fairly lightweight. And at 5.5-ish ounces on my scale, it is exactly that. ZG looks like they spared no expense when it came to removing material on this that wasn't 100% necessary. Just look at the deep cuts on this. I could measure the cross webbing on this, or the thickness of the webbing on this, but I guarantee you it's no thicker than what you see here. It is very, very pretty. The machining marks on this are, well, good. They're not great. They're not SCALARWORKS level of impressive, but neither is the price. About $350-ish for this is still a fair amount of money, but I will say that I think I'm a bigger fan of this style of lock and claw for the pick rail as opposed to the turnstile knobs found on SCALARWORKS. Now, of course, your mileage may vary, so for the rest of this, I'm just going to be completely nonpartisan as possible. Starting at the bottom, we do have two small blocks that will interfere with your pick rail. Now, two is better than one is better than none, but they are rather small. Usually this won't be much of an issue. However, I have experienced on some rails that have a U-notch in the middle that you really have to get this thing all the way to one side on the permanent side of the claw over here to have those little blocks just interfere enough to catch. If you're running this on a standard flat top AR, you won't have any issues like that because typically on flat top ARs, the pick rail is completely flat. It doesn't have a U-joint. So that shouldn't be an issue for 99.9% of the people that are going to be using this. While we're down here taking a look at the bottom of the mount, you can see we have a nice big old flat surface, those two little blocks on the inside, and two, I'd say roughly 1-inch sections on either side to secure this to your rail. On the fixed side, we do have relief cuts where those claws are, just to save as much weight as possible. Very impressive. On the adjustable claw side, we do have our torque specs milled into the face of the claw itself, so you never have to worry about wondering what you should be torquing these things to. 28 inch-pounds seems a little bit on the lower side, but I will go off of what this mount says. These do run T25 screws on the bottom, and they are very tight to get out. But once you get them out, you will see that there is a little rubber grommet on the inside, which is used to prevent the screw from backing out and falling out all the way if you were to unscrew it all the way. And on the inside, you can see we have a stainless steel thread cert on the inside. So we shouldn't have to worry about these threads getting ripped out even if you over torque them. There also appears to be a little bit of locking compound on the inside. So hopefully, once you torque this thing down, it shouldn't ever come out. Now, I'm sure some of you are probably saying, well, why don't they have springs in there to pop these claws up when you try to put this on a mount? Springs will add weight, so that is why they don't do that. As far as what we have moving up, this big flat spot on top of the mount is perfect for leveling the scope using the bottom of the erector housing and using a slide veneer or parallel bar. It is perfect. Very wide, very flat, and still deep enough that you shouldn't run into any interference issues even if you had a scope with a really big housing. Moving on to the clamshells, and you can see that there are some very light machining marks that pop up in this area here. And the reason for that is for them to be able to actually cut this relief cut in here at this sort of radius and that sort of tightness, you're using a bull nose end mill and doing a lot of little passes. So you're going to see the little steps in between that because it's almost inevitable unless you put a ton of extra passes in there to try to clean that up. I have no issues with how this looks because all in all, it doesn't look jarring or out of place. Just like we saw with the base, our torque specs are right there on top of the rings. Similar to some other mounts that we have seen, these do feature a vertical mount clamp, which I am a big fan of for a couple of reasons, which I'll be showcasing to you very soon. But it just makes life very easy. You only have 2 screws on either cap to remove, And the claws are part of the mount, so you can't lose those either. The mount uses T25s, the claws use T15s, which I would prefer seeing again, both of them running the same size, just my OCD being crazy. But again, the smaller screws are perfectly adequate for supporting this and all of its torque specs, and they are also lighter. Opening up the clamshell on top, and you can see that there was a lot of attention to detail put into the design on this to make sure that when you close this, it doesn't rock side to side. A lot of other vertical mounts that I've seen like this don't offer that. The benefit is, once you close this on top of a scope, you don't have to worry about it pulling to one side. It should self-center like it does right there. Cracking it back open, we can see that the machine marks inside the actual caps and mount themselves are almost non-existent. The anodizing on this is a little bit rougher than it is on some of its competitors, but that is not a negative. That just means that the outside isn't going to have the high sheen that you might like or the smoothness that you might prefer. This is completely serviceable, and some would probably prefer it because it gives it more of a flat finish, and that's going to prevent unnecessary flash. There's a little bit of play in the hinge on both sides, and that's just to make sure that the tolerances aren't too tight where it's going to bind up on you. Everything moves nice and smooth. Now, with other mounts that have this style of clamp, I have heard of people shearing these off, these pins backing out and breaking. That is unfortunately one of the only things that I could see being an issue with the style of clamp. Everything else, though, is a positive. Again, for saving as much weight as possible and giving it a very small, slim profile, this is really the best way to go. But if you are looking for more strength and security, going with a horizontal cap setup mount is going to be much more secure. Another reason for that rubber gasket in between this is, well, to answer my own question about earlier with people saying that, oh, well, why isn't there a spring in there? That rubber grommet, if you were to, let's say, close this all the way and then back it out, that rubber grommet is going to stick with the threads and pull the claw out. As you can see, it doesn't want to go anywhere until you push it and fight against that rubber grommet. So, very slick. As far as how it looks on a rail, like I mentioned earlier, it looks very slim and sleek. I like how short the claws are to the rail itself, so you don't have to worry about interference issues. And just look at how beautiful this thing flows. I love vertical cap scope mounts. They just look the part. Absolutely beautiful. Now, if you're curious about what are the colors these come in, obviously black, FDE, height-wise, 1.54, 1.70, and 1.93, and also 30 or 34 millimeter tubes. I should note, this is a 34 millimeter version, and it's a 1.7 on the height, indicated right there on the bottom. Very easy to see. I forgot to mention that earlier. I apologize. Anyway, even though this is a permanently attached mount, a good way of testing to see how well this thing is machined is by seeing if it can hold to zero when you pull it off your rail and put it back on a few times. So let's go test that right now. We're down here with the zero gravity mount, looking through my Gen 2 Razor HD 4.5 to 27 by 56. As you can very clearly tell, everything looks like it's lining up perfectly well. Yes, that is mold on my target. I'm going to have to make a new target because down here is very moist. This summer has absolutely sucked. Anyway, I currently have the mount torqued down to the 28 inch-pounds specified onto the rail. I'm now going to loosen up in sequence, starting with the rear. We're going to loosen it, then the front. She is very loose. I'm now going to snug up the rear, meaning I'm not going to torque it down all the way. I'm just going to tension it a little bit, then the front. Now I'm going to torque the rear, then torque the front. You'll see this before I do. Might be, it's definitely favoring that right edge, but less than 1/10 of a mil. Going to do that again. Loosen the rear, loosen the front. Okay, good movement. Pushing forward. You always want to make sure you're pushing forward on your mounts or your rings before you torque them. Rear is snugged, front is snugged, rear is torqued, front is torqued. That looks like it went right back to where we were from the beginning. We're going to do it one more time. She is loose, very good. Again, forward pressure. I'm going to snug the rear, snug the front, lock the rear, lock the front, and that's a perfect performance. I'm going to say that second one, or actually the first one that I didn't snug up as much as I did with the previous ones. So in order to go for gold, I'm going to do this another time. Sheath loose, pushing forward. I'm going to snug it a little bit more on the rear, then the front, then lock or torque the rear, torque the front. And that is an absolutely bang on perfect performance. Very, very good setup on this and reset. And I love how svelte this mount looks. It really is quite pretty. But there's one other thing I want to test. So we just watched the mount reset on the rail perfectly, flawlessly. Another thing I want to test though is, will this vertical clamshell design prevent the scope from rotating if we were to loosen it up and then retorque it? So I'm going to start with the rear, loosening them up. And then I will do the exact same style of sequence as I did with the mount itself onto the rail. So this scope, as you can now very clearly tell, is loose inside the rings. I'm going to leave it level. I'm going to adjust the windage to my target, which you can see. It's perfectly lined up. I'm going to snug the inside screws, then the outside screws, then torque the inside screws, and then the outside screws. I'm not expecting the reticle to be 100% stable as far as position goes. I'm looking for rotation. The hardest thing for a lot of people is making sure that the scope doesn't rotate when you are torquing down horizontal screws. The vertical mounts should prevent a lot of that. So let's find out if this mount will do that. The torque specs on the ring, on the caps or the ring section is 18 inch-pounds. So 10 less inch-pounds than the mount to the rail. All right, they are snugged. I'm going to start with the inside rear to torque, inside front to torque, then outside rear to torque, outside front. Now it did shift, but I was expecting the shift. Might have rotated a little bit at the very far bottom at 10 mils. Definitely favoring that bottom left edge, whereas the center looks like it's more or less lined up. But I'm going to double check the torque again, because you always want to go back and repeat the process when you have multiple screws on something. And in this case, there was at least 2 screws that went a little bit extra. So now I adjust the windage. It still looks like it might have rotated clockwise. The scope rotated clockwise, but a very minimal amount. I want to do this one more time, because that's still a very good performance. If you were to torque down horizontal rings, odds are, if you're not paying super close attention, you're going to have the scope rotate on you. Sometimes it's a good thing. You're allowed that little bit of adjustability with it to fine tune it, but if you don't have a very good setup from the beginning, it's going to be annoying. That looks pretty good to me. I'm going to do the exact same setup, snug the inside, snug the outside, and then torque to follow. And I'm going to start off by torquing every screw twice to remove any potential slack. There's definitely slack in at least one of those screws. Notice that I have not touched the elevation, but the elevation comes right back down. Look at that. Perfect, perfect, perfect. No adjustments necessary. Elevation came right back to where it was, and adjusting the windage back to where I had originally started out when we started this segment, it's as good as you could possibly get. A truly perfect performance. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Not only is this mount very nicely made, very lightweight, it also keeps zero perfectly if you do your part right. And because of its vertical mounting setup, we do not have to worry about having the scope cant itself accidentally when you are torquing down the rings. Another thing to note, which I didn't mention earlier as to why I really like vertical rings in most cases, is I line up the hash mark on the top of the erector with the gap on the ring itself. As you saw, the reticle on this Razer HD Gen 2 4.5 to 27 by 56 lined up basically perfectly to my target, and that is exactly where it was when I set it up like this. Now that might not be the case all of the time for you, and when you set your things up, it's always great to double check it, but to get you in the ballpark, probably in the right section, very close to the right seat, that's what I do about 99% of the time. That's another reason why I run ADM mounts for all of my scope reviews, because I can swap out the mounts to whatever size clamshells that I want as far as diameter goes, and because they're vertical, they're really, really fast to have me line these things up before I start filming with them. Now, having a 5.5 ounce mount with a, as near as makes no difference, 50 ounce scope inside of it, that's a bit of an oxymoron. But this is the scope that I use for all of my 34mm mount tests. Overall, I'm quite impressed by this Summit mount by Zero Gravity. I think for the price, it offers a lot of really slick features, and because of its performance here today, I'm confident you're not going to have a problem with one of these. And if you do, hopefully they'll take care of you. With all that being said, ladies and gentlemen, a huge thank you again to my friend Eric over at tyrannynotallowed.com for sending this mount in to test and review. I have to say, I am very pleased. So, Eric, thank you very much. And of course, thank you all very much for watching. As always, I'll see you again next time. And a huge thank you to my Patreon providers and my Subscribe subscribers. Without you, this truly wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to support my channel but don't want to join either of those, I completely understand. But you could still help by using my affiliate links in the description below, and or like, share, and subscribe as always. Again, thank you very much.